October 1886. The Bitterroot Valley, Montana Territory. The frost had already eaten 2 inches into the soil by the time the wagon left. It didn't slow down at the bend in the road. It didn't stop at the tree line. It just kept rolling west, carrying everything that had been agreed upon in a courthouse 30 miles away. The tools, the stored grain, the iron stove, the horse, and the man who had decided he was done. What it left behind was a woman named Della Marsh, 31 years old, standing at the edge of a half-cleared lot with a 4-year-old daughter at her hip, a wool blanket folded over one shoulder, and exactly $3.14 in a leather pouch tucked beneath her coat. The nearest town, Granville Crossing, was 11 miles north. The nearest neighbor, a homesteader named Orville Peck, was 2.5 miles through scrub timber. He had already looked over the fence that summer and said, with no particular cruelty, just the frank certainty of a man who had survived 3 Montana winters, "That lot won't winter a dog, let alone a family." He wasn't wrong about the lot. The clearing faced north. There was no existing structure. The timber was green and wet, and the calendar was past mid-October, which in the Bitterroot meant the window for traditional cabin construction had already closed. What Orville Peck didn't account for, what nobody in Granville Crossing accounted for, was what Della Marsh had learned as a child in the hill country of southwestern Virginia, where her grandmother had built 3 homes from the ground up using nothing but what the earth gave freely. In Virginia, they called it mud building. Della called it the only option she had left. She set her daughter down on the blanket, took out the folded piece of paper she had been carrying since September, and drew a rectangle in the dirt with a stick. Then she started walking the perimeter of what would become, in less than 3 weeks, one of the warmest structures in the entire valley, at a total materials cost of $3 flat. If you've ever been told that survival belongs only to those with resources, stay with us. Because what Della built that October is still one of the most thermally efficient shelter designs ever documented in the American frontier record, and it cost less than a sack of flour. Back-end index pointing right. If you're new here, subscribe now. Every week we uncover a real frontier technique that worked when lives depended on it. Hit that bell so you never miss one. Della Marsh had not planned to become a builder. She had grown up in Tazewell County, Virginia, the second of 7 children in a family that moved twice before she turned 12. Her father was a timberman, often absent. Her mother kept a kitchen garden and a small dairy operation. But it was her maternal grandmother, a woman named Cora Sutton, who had shaped the way Della saw the physical world. Cora had built her own home in 1849 using a method she called the old way, a technique she credited to the women of her community who, she explained plainly, had learned to build with what the earth offered because they were rarely given access to what the timber market sold. She packed earthen walls from a mixture of clay-heavy subsoil, dry grass, and a small amount of wood ash. She laid stone foundations by hand. She shaped her walls to be nearly 22 inches thick at the base, tapering slightly toward the eaves. And she angled her single fireplace corner, not centered on the north wall as most builders did, but tucked into the southeast corner of the structure, where Cora said, "The heat has somewhere to go and a reason to stay." Della had helped build that structure as a girl of 9. She had mixed the mud herself, in her bare feet, singing to keep pace with the work. She had never expected to use that knowledge in Montana. She had expected a different life. But standing in the Bitterroot in October 1886, with the aspens already bare and the first hard cold settling into the foothills, she understood that what her grandmother had given her wasn't nostalgia. It was engineering. The plan came to her not as a flash of genius, but as a series of practical constraints. She couldn't fell and notch timber fast enough for a log cabin. Not alone, not without a broadaxe. She couldn't afford cut lumber. She couldn't leave her daughter to haul stone for a full masonry structure. But she was standing on top of approximately 3 feet of dense, clay-heavy subsoil, the same geological composition that had made the Bitterroot Valley fertile for farming. That clay, mixed with the dried grass from the adjacent meadow and stiffened with wood ash from a small fire, would compress into building blocks that could cure in 3 to 4 days under dry conditions. The October air was cold, but it was dry. There had been no rain in 11 days. She had her material. She had her method. She had her hands. What she didn't have, and what the people of Granville Crossing were about to make very clear, was anyone's belief that she could pull it off. Before we follow Della into the build, it's worth pausing because the word mud has done a lot of damage to the reputation of one of the most effective building systems in human history. What Della Marsh was constructing was not a mud hut in any casual sense of the phrase. She was building a cob structure, a form of monolithic earthen construction that had been practiced continuously in the British Isles since at least the 13th century and independently developed across North Africa, the Middle East, the American Southwest, and the Appalachian Highlands. The material itself, a compressed mixture of clay subsoil, fibrous organic material, in Della's case, dried meadowgrass, and stabilizing ash, behaves in ways that most 19th century timber builders would have found counterintuitive. Here's what makes it work. Thermal mass. A cob wall 18 to 24 inches thick stores heat the way a cast iron skillet stores heat, slowly, deeply, and for a long time. Unlike timber, which conducts heat relatively quickly from inside to outside, a thick earthen wall acts as a thermal battery. It absorbs warmth from the interior during the hours when the fire burns, and then releases that warmth slowly, over 6 to 10 hours after the fire dies down. In practical terms, this means a well-built cob structure can maintain a livable interior temperature for significantly longer than a conventional timber cabin of equivalent size, using considerably less fuel. The mix. Della worked with a ratio her grandmother had taught her, roughly 2 parts clay-heavy subsoil to 1 part dry, fibrous material, with wood ash added until the mixture no longer stuck to her palm when pressed. This ash component served a dual purpose. It stiffened the mix slightly and improved its resistance to cracking as it dried. She tested each batch by rolling a small ball and dropping it from shoulder height. If it shattered, the clay content was too low. If it flattened without cracking, it held. The walls. She built them 20 inches thick at the base, tapering to 16 inches at the eave line, roughly 5 feet high, with a low-pitched roof supported by 4 salvage poles she negotiated from Orville Peck's woodpile in exchange for 3 days of fence mending, to be paid the following spring. The walls went up in horizontal lifts of approximately 8 inches per day, each layer left to firm before the next was added. The fireplace. This is where Cora Sutton's teaching mattered most. Rather than placing the hearth on the center of the north wall, the most common frontier placement, which sent radiant heat directly toward the door and out into the cold every time it opened, Della built a small corner firebox into the southeast interior corner, using flat stones gathered from the creek bed a quarter-mile east. The corner placement created what thermal engineers today would recognize as a radiant enclosure effect. Heat emanating from a corner fireplace reflects off 2 adjacent walls simultaneously, distributing warmth more evenly across the interior volume than a single flat-wall hearth can achieve. The stone surround, roughly 4 inches of creek sandstone lining the firebox and extending 18 inches up each adjacent wall, absorbed combustion heat and re-radiated it into the room at a lower, steadier rate long after the fire itself had subsided. The entire structure measured 14 feet by 16 feet, modest by any standard. But those 224 square feet were about to retain heat in a way that would leave Granville Crossing without a single good argument. First, though, it had to survive the town's opinion. Word traveled fast in the Bitterroot Valley, the way it always does in small places where winter gives people too much time to think and not enough to do. By the 3rd day of construction, Orville Peck had mentioned Della's project to the men at the Granville Crossing feed store. By the 5th day, 2 of those men had ridden out to see it. By the end of the first week, the build had acquired a nickname, the Mud Hole. Most of the commentary was harmless, the particular brand of skepticism common to frontier communities, where people who had survived by doing things a certain way were genuinely suspicious of anyone doing things differently. One woman from the church auxiliary sent a note, through Orville, suggesting that Della might consider staying in town through winter if she didn't feel confident in her arrangements. 3 men offered unsolicited estimates of how long the walls would last before they slumped and ran in the first rain. Estimates range from 1 season to 1 storm. But the remark that got repeated most, the one that found its way into at least 2 written accounts from that period, including a letter preserved in the Ravalli County Historical Archive, came from a man named Silas Compton. Silas Compton was the most experienced builder in the Granville Crossing area. He had constructed 11 log cabins, 2 commercial buildings, and the frame of the Baptist church. He was 62 years old, originally from Wisconsin, and he had a reputation for bluntness that people in the valley described, depending on their relationship with him, as either refreshing or insufferable. He rode out on a Thursday morning in the second week of October, dismounted without being invited, walked the perimeter of Della's half-finished structure in silence, and then said 4 words that would follow him for the rest of his life in that community: "Clay don't hold heat." He remounted and left. It was, in the most concentrated possible form, the conventional wisdom of an entire era of American frontier construction. And it was, as Della already knew from 22 years of watching her grandmother's home outlast every timber structure in Tazewell County, factually incorrect. Clay, specifically clay-rich earthen mass at sufficient wall thickness, holds heat extremely well. It holds it slowly, deeply, and for far longer than timber or plank construction at equivalent thickness. This is not folk knowledge. It is the principle of thermal mass, which had been documented in Roman engineering texts, in the writings of medieval European stonemasons, and in the construction practices of the Pueblo peoples of the American Southwest, whose adobe structures maintained interior temperatures as much as 20 degrees Fahrenheit to 30 degrees Fahrenheit, 11 degrees Celsius to 17 degrees Celsius, warmer than exterior conditions on comparable cold nights. Della did not explain any of this to Silas Compton. She was in the middle of mixing her 9th batch of cob. She let the walls speak when the time came. The time came sooner than anyone expected. The storm rolled in from the northwest on the night of November 7th, 1886. Weather records from the Fort Missoula garrison, located approximately 45 miles north of the Bitterroot Valley, logged the system as it descended from the Canadian plains. Sustained winds of 28 to 34 miles per hour, temperatures dropping from 19 degrees Fahrenheit minus 7 degrees Celsius at sundown to minus 4 degrees Fahrenheit minus 20 degrees Celsius by 2 in the morning, with snowfall accumulating at a rate of approximately 2 inches per hour through the early part of the night. It was not the worst storm the valley had seen, but it came early, before most households had finished their wood stacking, before the ground was fully prepared, and before anyone had expected to face a true test of their winter shelter. Della's cabin had been complete for 12 days. The walls had cured in the dry October air, a period of 11 consecutive days without rain, which oral accounts suggest Della had tracked with a kind of careful attention that bordered on prayer. The corner fireplace had been fired twice for testing, each time holding a clean draw with no smoke back. The roof, a low, sloped arrangement of salvage poles covered with a layer of packed sod and a tarp traded from Orville Peck's barn, sat tight against the eave line. The single window, south-facing, was covered with a piece of oiled muslin stretched across a frame of bent willow. On the evening of November 7th, Della fed the corner firebox with approximately 4 pounds of dry wood, roughly equivalent in volume to a large armful of split oak kindling, brought the interior temperature to what she later estimated as well above comfortable, and then let the fire burn down to coals before covering the ash pit with a flat stone. She did not add wood again until morning. That fact, 4 pounds of wood, no overnight feeding, will become the most discussed number in Granville Crossing for the next 2 years. Because 11 miles north, in the town itself, families were burning through their wood stacks at a pace that alarmed even the most experienced among them. The conventional log cabins of the valley, built with 8 to 10-inch round timber walls, were conducting heat outward as fast as their occupants could generate it. Stoves ran through the night. Families woke at 2 and 4 in the morning to reload. One household, according to a letter from that winter, burned nearly 30 pounds of wood between sundown and sunrise, with children still complaining of cold feet by dawn. 2 miles from Della's cabin, Orville Peck burned his stove continuously from 9 p.m. to 6 a.m., consuming a full quart of wood over the course of that week's cold snap. Inside the 14 by 16-foot cob structure, the temperature at dawn, recorded by a small mercury thermometer Della, had hung on the south wall, read 52 degrees Fahrenheit, 11 degrees Celsius. Outside, at the same moment, it was -6 degrees Fahrenheit, -21 degrees Celsius. A differential of 58 degrees Fahrenheit. Overnight, with 4 pounds of wood and no active fire. The blizzard had not asked for permission, and the walls had not needed to be told what to do. Stay with us, because what happened when the sun came up that morning changed every conversation in Granville Crossing. The number that dismantled Silas Compton's 4 words is coming next. Back into Next Pointing Right. If this story is teaching you something real, subscribe and leave a comment. Where are you watching from? And what's the coldest night you've ever had to shelter through? The morning after the storm, Orville Peck did what curious men in small valleys always do after a night that tests everyone equally. He put on his coat and walked toward the thing he didn't understand. He expected to find damage. A slump wall, maybe. A roof that had buckled under the snow load. At minimum, he expected to find Della feeding a fire that had burned all night just to keep the child alive. What he found instead stopped him at the door. Della was outside. She was splitting kindling, not in a panic, not in urgency, but with the measured pace of someone doing morning work. Her daughter, May, was seated near the south wall of the cabin, in a patch of weak November sunlight, eating from a tin bowl. The cabin behind them showed no signs of distress. The walls, now fully cured to a pale buff gray, stood solid under approximately 14 inches of snow that had compressed against their base overnight. Not a single crack had opened in the surface. Not a single section had shifted. Orville looked at the wood stack by the door. It was barely diminished. "How much did you burn last night?" he asked. Della told him. He didn't believe her. So she showed him the ash pit, a shallow depression at the base of the firebox, lined with flat creek stone. The ash volume was consistent with a small evening fire, burned to coals and covered around 8 o'clock. No overnight feeding. No pre-dawn reload. Orville Peck was not a man given to outward expression, according to his own letters from that period. But he later wrote to his brother in Ohio that standing at that ash pit on the morning of November 8th, 1886, he felt as though someone had removed a wall I had not known I was leaning against. The comparison that emerged over the following week was stark enough that it required no interpretation. Oral accounts and 2 surviving letters from Granville Crossing residents that winter allow for a reasonable reconstruction of the thermal performance differential between Della's cob structure and a standard log cabin construction typical of the valley. The numbers, presented in equivalent conditions, same exterior temperature range, same interior floor area approximation, same duration of cold snap, told a clear story. Interior temperature at dawn, November 8th, Della's 20-inch cob walls, corner firebox, no overnight fire. 52 degrees Fahrenheit, 11 degrees Celsius. Orville Peck's 9-inch round log cabin. Center wall cast iron stove, fire burning all night. 41 degrees Fahrenheit, 5 degrees Celsius. A neighbor's newer plank frame cabin, stove running continuously. 36 degrees Fahrenheit, 2 degrees Celsius. That is a difference of 11 degrees Fahrenheit to 16 degrees Fahrenheit, 6 degrees Celsius to 9 degrees Celsius, at dawn, after Della's fire had been out for approximately 10 hours. Wood consumption, November 7th sundown to November 8th sunrise. Della's cabin, approximately 4 pounds of dry split oak. 1 evening load, fire covered at 8 p.m. Orville Peck's cabin, approximately 22 pounds across 3 overnight reloads. Valley average reported in correspondence. Between 18 and 32 pounds per household per night during the cold snap. Della structure consumed roughly 1/5 the fuel of the average valley cabin during the same overnight period, while maintaining a warmer interior at sunrise. Heat retention window. Time from fire extinction to interior temperature dropping below 45 degrees Fahrenheit, 7 degrees Celsius. Della's cob structure, estimated 11 to 13 hours, based on her thermometer readings across multiple nights that winter. Orville Peck's log cabin, approximately 3 to 4 hours before temperatures drop below comfort threshold without active fire. This last figure is the one that demands the most attention, because it explains everything about why the cob wall outperformed the log wall, and it has. Nothing to do with magic and everything to do with physics. A 9-inch round log wall has a relatively low thermal mass per square foot. Wood is an organic material with decent insulating properties. It resists the transfer of heat reasonably well, but does not store heat in meaningful volume. Once the fire stops generating warmth, a timber cabin's interior temperature begins to fall within the hour because there is no stored heat in the structure itself to replace what is being lost through the walls. A 20-inch cob wall containing clay-rich earthen mass, by contrast, behaves more like a stone structure than a timber one. The clay and mineral content give it a volumetric heat capacity, a capacity to store thermal energy within the mass of the wall itself, that is roughly 3 to 4 times greater than an equivalent volume of dry timber. During the hours when the fire burns, that wall is absorbing heat. When the fire dies, the wall begins returning that stored heat to the interior, slowly, steadily, for hours. Della's corner placement amplified this effect by ensuring that 2 walls simultaneously absorbed and re-radiated heat from a single firebox, rather than one wall, doing all the thermal work while the opposite 3 walls remain passive. In modern building science, this principle is called thermal lag, the delay between when a material absorbs heat and when it releases it. Adobe, rammed earth, and cob structures have been engineered around this principle for thousands of years. In the Bitterroot Valley in the winter of 1886, it meant that a woman who had spent less than $3 on construction materials was warmer at sunrise than every neighbor who had built with conventional methods. Silas Compton did not ride out that morning, but the report reached him before noon. The change did not come as a dramatic announcement. There was no town meeting, no formal acknowledgement, no moment where Silas Compton rode back to the marsh lot and said the words that needed to be said. That is not how small frontier communities absorb new information. They absorb it the way clay absorbs heat, slowly, quietly, and without any visible seam. It began with questions. Orville Peck was the first. He came back in late November, this time without the pretense of a casual visit, and asked Della directly to walk him through the firebox placement. She did, drawing the geometry in the snow with a stick, the southeast corner position, the stone surround, the way the 2 adjacent walls acted as a double radiating surface, the ash pit placement that allowed residual coals to continue warming the stone through the night, even after the active flame was gone. He took no notes. He didn't need to. He had been building structures since he was 14 years old, and once the principle was visible to him, it was obvious. "I built my fireplace wrong," he said, according to his own account. We all did. By January of 1887, 3 men from Granville Crossing had ridden out to view the structure at Della's invitation. She charged nothing for the information and offered nothing as a formal lesson. She simply answered questions and let the walls demonstrate the answers that words couldn't fully carry. One of the 3, a homesteader named Amos Rutledge, asked if she would help him relocate the firebox in his existing cabin the following spring. She agreed in exchange for help reinforcing her roof ahead of the spring thaw. By the spring of 1887, 5 households in the valley had begun the process of either relocating their fireboxes to interior corner positions, adding stone mass, surrounds to existing hearths, or, in 2 cases, planning new construction using cob walls for the interior sections most exposed to north and west wind. By the winter of 1888, oral accounts suggest that at least 9 structures within a 12-mile radius of Della's original lot had incorporated some version of the thermal mass principle she had demonstrated, whether in the form of corner fireboxes, stone-backed hearth walls, or sections of earthen construction integrated into otherwise timber frame structures. Silas Compton, for his part, rebuilt the hearth in his own home in the fall of 1887. He relocated it to the northeast interior corner and lined the surrounding walls with 2 inches of sandstone flags sourced from the same creek bed Della had used. He told the man who helped him with the stonework, a younger builder named Calvin Hurst, that the change was his own idea, prompted by something he had read. Calvin Hurst, who had heard Orville Peck's full account of the November morning by then, said nothing to contradict this. But Della knew, and the valley knew, and in the way that knowledge settles into a place and begins to belong to everyone without any formal ceremony, the Marsh cabin's approach to winter, Mud walls, corner fire, stone surround, ash pit, low roof, south window became simply the way you built if you were building to stay warm. What is remarkable, looking back from this distance, is not that the technique worked. Earthen construction had worked for centuries before Della Marsh mixed her first batch of cob in the Bitterroot Valley. What is remarkable is the speed with which a method dismissed as primitive, foolish, and structurally unsound by the most experienced builder in the region was adopted, quietly, without credit, without ceremony, once a single winter had delivered the data that argument alone could not. Della never applied for a patent. She never wrote up her methods in a formal document. She taught anyone who asked, in the way her grandmother Cora had taught her, by doing the work alongside them and letting the physics of the thing explain itself. By 1889, her daughter May was helping her mix cob for a small addition to the south side of the cabin, a lean-to root cellar that would keep their stored vegetables above freezing through even the hardest months, using the same thermal mass principle applied to underground mass instead of above-grade walls. The structure stood, according to county records, through at least 1921, 35 years from its construction date. The walls never slumped. The roof was replaced twice. The corner firebox, the original one, built from creek stone and clay mortar for a total cost that Della had recorded in her own hand as nothing, being from the ground itself, was still in use at the time of the last recorded occupancy. 35 years, $3, and the knowledge of a woman in Virginia who had understood, long before the textbooks caught up, that the ground beneath your feet is not just something to stand on. It is something to build with. There is a particular kind of arrogance that settles into communities that have survived hard things. It is not malicious. It is the arrogance of earned experience. The certainty that because something has worked before and because the people who built it are still alive to say so, it must be the right way. In Granville Crossing in 1886, that certainty wore the face of round log timber construction, iron stoves centered on north walls, and the unquestioned belief that anything built from the ground itself was a last resort, a mark of failure, a thing you did when you had nothing. Della Marsh had nothing, and she built something that outlasted almost everything around it. This is not a story about genius. Della did not invent cob construction. She did not discover thermal mass. She did not engineer the corner firebox principle from mathematical first principles sitting alone on the Montana frontier. She did something in some ways more valuable. She remembered what she had been taught, trusted it when the conditions demanded trust, and applied it with the kind of careful, patient attention that no amount of textbook knowledge can fully substitute for. Her grandmother Cora Sutton had built 3 homes in Virginia that way. Before Cora, the technique had come from women in her community who had learned it from people whose names the historical record did not preserve. People who had understood, through generations of cold winters and scarce resources, that the earth is not passive. It stores. It releases. It holds what you give it and returns it slowly at the hour you need it most. That understanding, practical, physical, specific, is what $3 bought in the Bitterroot Valley in October 1886. What the winter of 1886 to 87 demonstrated in the Bitterroot Valley was not a curiosity. It was a proof of principle that modern building scientists would recognize without hesitation. Thermal mass works. A wall material with high volumetric heat capacity, clay, stone, rammed earth, adobe, cob, absorbs heat during the active burning period and releases it over 6 to 14 hours after the fire is extinguished. The thicker the wall, the longer the release. The more enclosed the firebox geometry, particularly a corner placement with 2 radiating wall surfaces, the more evenly that stored heat distributes through the interior volume. Fuel efficiency follows directly. When a structure's walls are doing the thermal work of maintaining interior temperature through the night, the occupant's fire needs only to reload the thermal battery, not to continuously fight the cold in real time. In practical terms, as Della's first winter demonstrated repeatedly, this can reduce overnight fuel consumption by 60% to 80% compared to an equivalent area timber structure under the same exterior conditions. The principle scales. Della's 14 by 16 foot cabin was small by design. A smaller interior volume requires less energy to heat and is easier for a single firebox to serve. But the same thermal mass principle applies to structures of any scale. The Anasazi cliff dwellings of the American Southwest, the black houses of the Scottish Hebrides, the cave homes of Cappadocia in Turkey, the Barabara shelters of the Anangax people of Alaska. Across cultures, across continents, across centuries, wherever people faced cold winters and limited fuel, they found their way to the same physical truth. Mass holds heat, and heat in the walls is heat that works for you while you sleep. Modern construction has largely traded this principle for insulation, a different strategy with its own merits, but one that prioritizes resistance to heat transfer rather than storage of it. There are contexts where insulation is clearly superior. There are contexts, particularly in climates with cold nights and warm days, or in off-grid situations where fuel is scarce, where thermal mass remains the more efficient choice. The engineers who design passive solar homes today, the builders who work with rammed earth and adobe in the American Southwest, the researchers who study vernacular architecture in extreme climates, they're all, in their way, rediscovering what Cora Sutton knew in Virginia in 1849 and what Della Marsh applied to Montana in 1886. The knowledge was never lost. It was only, for a time, dismissed. Silas Compton lived until 1903. Whether he ever acknowledged Della Marsh's contribution directly, the historical record does not confirm. What the record does show, through county construction filings and a brief mention in a 1901 Granville Crossing Church newsletter, is that in his later years, he became known for advising younger builders in the valley to mind the corner and use stone where you can. No one who heard him say it needed to ask where he had learned that. Some knowledge arrives through books, some through formal instruction, and some through the winter, through the particular, unforgiving, perfectly democratic cold that does not care what anyone believed before it arrived and records its verdict not in words, but in degrees. 52 degrees Fahrenheit. Inside. At dawn. After a night at -6. With 4 pounds of wood and walls made from the ground she was standing on. That is what Della Marsh built. That is what $3 understood about heat. And that understanding, passed from Cora Sutton to her granddaughter, from the marsh lot to the Bitterroot Valley, from one cold winter to the builders who came after, is still true today and still available to anyone willing to learn it. The frontier did not reward the most confident voice in the room. It rewarded the warmest cabin at sunrise. Back in index pointing right, if this story changed the way you think about building and heat, leave a comment right now and tell us, where are you watching from, and what is the coldest night you have ever had to shelter through? We read every single comment. Subscribe if you haven't yet. Every week, a real technique, a real story, and a real winter that proved it right. Educational note. This video presents historically inspired reconstructions for educational and storytelling purposes. Characters, names, and specific events are fictional, while the techniques, concepts, and principles discussed are based on real historical practices and well-established physical or practical knowledge. Any modern application should be evaluated according to current standards, safety guidelines, and applicable laws or regulations. This content is educational in nature and does not constitute professional, technical, or legal advice.